Just as a broad topic, what we're going to discuss is what I would call the ancient astronaut theory, but specifically for tonight's workshop, I'm going to focus on pieces of technology that have been found throughout history, going back to the Sumerians and even before them, but put into a larger context of a view that shows man has probably been on Earth a lot longer than we think. At this point, it stands on the shoulders of the Sumerian culture for the first civilization. But all throughout history, we have megalithic monuments, theories about an Atlantean civilization, perhaps some ancient civilization that existed probably 10, 15,000 years ago, but finding the evidence for this culture on one continent or one specific site has eluded scholars. But as we'll see tonight, there could be a global evidence shown on all continents for a very superior technological culture or civilization that did exist at one time. So ancient technology. Many of the artifacts that have come out of modern archaeological excavations still don't have an answer to what their full purpose could have been. This is an interesting item known as the Antikythera mechanism. It was found by some sponge divers in 1908 off the coast of Antikythera. And what's so interesting about this mechanism is that it's basically a handheld planetarium. Now, this under radar showed that it had over between 38 and 70 different little cogs and wheels, more complicated than a modern-day Swiss watch, yet it's over 2,000 years old. They don't know how it was made or who could have created it, but they give theories that possibly someone like Archimedes or someone in the great Greek time period would have had the knowledge to build this type of device, yet they really don't know for sure. But what's interesting about this is that it basically served two purposes. One, as an astronomical device where you could plot, the North Star is close to Venus, and if I chart my court in this direction, they could use this device to find out the positions of the planets. But it was also an astrological device, so that it would tell the person who held this box, if I was born today, 50 years ago, I can see that my sign is aligned with Sun and Venus. And so back then, 2,000 years ago, in the high, Greek council, having astrological information to be able to tell people, your planet sign is this, and you interact with Mars, was esoteric information. So this device served that purpose, yet it was 2,000 years removed from, us trying to figure out who could have possibly built it. Here's a rendition of it would have looked like inside of its box. So another interesting area of information that I like to point out is Egypt. I'm going to kind of jump around from various parts of the information tonight in the workshop because there's just so many of these pieces that, when shown from their own aspect, will fit into the bigger picture. Some of the artifacts shown in Dendera in Egypt, we have tombs and recesses, dark crypts all over Egypt that have intricate hieroglyphs on all over the walls and the ceiling. And Egyptologists will say, if there's no evidence of flame, no carbon burning or soot on the ceiling, how are they lighting in these dark recesses to actually to carve these hieroglyphs or to paint them? The only other theory aside from a torch would be copper reflective mirrors. Now, copper can only reflect so far down these shafts, so an alternative theory is they had electricity. You can see what they're clearly holding up here, what looks like a light bulb, and it's actually plugged into some type of device. Now, modern archaeologists today say, this is an eggplant. They're holding up an eggplant symbolically. Okay. Well, to me, it looks like a very large, what could be attributed as a light bulb. Now, what I did was, in the same time period of the Egyptian culture, which is roughly 2500 BC, we've also found another interesting artifact, which has been known as the Baghdad Battery. And so I've come up with a theory that in the same time period of the Egyptian culture, in that same era, we have the Sumerian civilization. And in their own rise to technology, we've discovered over a dozen of what are called the Baghdad batteries, which is basically a 4,000-year-old battery. It's a copper jar with a clay jar with a copper lining and iron rod down the center. And if you fill it with a weak acidic liquid like grape juice or vinegar, lemon juice, and you touch the copper and the iron, you get a positive charge. Now, Eric von Daniken actually made a relief of what's shown on the wall, and had done a test where he created a light bulb and powered it just to scale as shown on the wall, and it actually functioned. It worked. Now here's an actual picture of the Baghdad battery of what was found. I recently did an on-camera experiment for the Discovery Channel where I generated positive 4 full volts consistently using a replicated battery shown here in the far right corner. And now if you figure 4 volts from one of these, you stack up 2 or 3 of these, you instantly get up to a 9 volt, 12 volt battery, which could power what we have today in our modern devices like flashlights. So you combine this with something like that, and maybe possibly an alternative view was that they actually were harnessing electricity. The other theory is that archaeologists today say, okay, maybe they had a battery, but the only thing that we would accept that they would be using this for would be electroplating, so that you could basically heat up silver, gold, and then spray it over jewelry and find precious elements, which they have a lot of evidence to show that that's what it was being used for. This is an alternative view for what it could have been used for. And you can see here again just a little showing that you put these 2 positive negatives on the voltmeter and you would get a positive charge. So ancient engineering, unexplainable archaeology. This kind of goes again into the theory of an Atlantean culture, maybe someone predating the oldest civilization of which we'll get deeply into here, the Sumerian culture. But there's evidence all over the earth of these megalithic monuments that are left to cultures that have been built on their civilizations on top of it. So in South America, for instance, Tiwanaku, Teotihuacan, we have many of these sites with megalithic monuments that we can't explain who built them. And if you were to ask the Mayans or the Incas or the Toltecs, who built these structures, they say, oh, well, these were built by Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl, the gods. They say that there was another great civilization that was here that predated them, yet what's the evidence to show that they existed? Where did they go? So what I point out is that we have these megalithic structures all over the earth that when looked at closely, there's no explanation for how they got there. Here are stones found in Pumapuku which basically fit together like Legos. They're built in such an intricate way, carved such a way so that they would fit together. You can see here also there was molten liquid metal poured to connect these devices. Amazing technology for a culture that's 4,000 years old. And you can see here, this larger one, there's symmetrical drilled holes, precision drilled holes throughout the stone. And there's no way to do this without modern technology of some type of a drill. Yet here it is, and stands for all time of evidence to see. So there's stones all around the world, these megalithic stones. This is a great image because it's actually Ted. I believe this is the image of Ted here, who's filming somewhere back here on the left. And this is a trip that they took some people with Zachariah Sitchin. And this is a stone that's in Baalbek in Lebanon. Now what's so interesting about this is that we have stacked several miles from this quarry site, these stones that are trilithiton stones, huge stacked stones. Let me just stay on this image for a minute. And this is where the quarry site of where the stones were taken from, because here's one that was that broke and they left it at the quarry site. There's no way physically today for us to get into a rock that large, wedge in there, and somehow lift it out. These are like 100,000 tons. So there's just no way possible that through our own feats of technology today that we could even build something like this or the pyramids in Egypt. So that's why we go into the next thing here, is the pyramid connection. All around the world there are pyramidal structures on every continent, and there's really no explanation for how they were built or why they were built. You'll hear that possibly the Egyptians used this as ceremonial tombs for the pharaohs, yet the king's chamber and the queen's chamber in the Great Pyramid have no evidence of hieroglyphics. And you'd think that if it was a king or a queen being buried in a pyramid, the walls would be inscribed full of praise to the king or the pharaoh. That's not the case. So there's all types of alternative views that say maybe the pyramids have been used for some type of advanced energy harnessing system, some type of way to tap into an energy source. But we really don't have an answer for who really built the pyramids or what their purpose was. So, when we start to look around the world, specifically starting in South America, we have evidence of archaeological sites pointing to astronomical locations and set out in a way where it's been designed to point towards certain astronomical alignments. What's really interesting about the South American pyramids is that it's theorized that there's literally a pyramid for every planet in our known solar system, and that these actually are plotting the various planets that we have. Now, this isn't a widely known or accepted view, but the interesting thing is that these pyramids are known as the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun. They do have a correlation to an astronomical terminology. So it's an interesting, layout when we look at the sophistication and the grandeur of something built by a culture that's, again, what we don't attribute to, Stone Age cultures or primitive technology, yet they have knowledge that's been displayed in a way where now with our sciences and understandings we can look at this and use radar and mapping, look at the telemetry and say, well, wait a minute, how could they have known that this is actually 1/10 of a degree off to the true north? So some of these pyramids, again, the Great Pyramid of the Sun, it's a very interesting coincidence that the base of the Pyramid of the Sun and the base of the Pyramid in Giza are very close in scale. And when you look through, again, some of these pyramids, this is very comparable to the Egyptian size and mass, but there's really no explanation for what they were being used for other than other previous cultures of them come, in South America, Mayans, the Toltecs, Aztecs, and have come in and taken over these lands and these monuments for themselves, assuming that they were built by their ancestors. But when we start to get into some of these more interesting, well-known structures like the three Giza pyramids, there's a lot of unanswered questions, because if the pyramids were built by the Egyptians 2500 BC, roughly 4500 years ago, then how is it possible that there's alignments taking place here that just can't be explained in that time period? What we have here is satellite data that shows the three Giza pyramids, and then what we have is a constellation of Orion, the three stars of Orion, so that in the year 10,500 BC, using computer mapping software on your PC, Redshift, various programs, you can chart where the stars are going to be in the heavens forwards in time and also backwards in time, so that maybe in a week from now I can say, oh look, Orion's going to be right above my house. Cool, I can go out and see it. You can also roll the clock back in time, and it turns out in 10,500 BC, the pyramids form a terrestrial map of Orion. They are exactly lined up with the pyramid offset, just like Orion, perfectly matching in 10,500 BC, mimicking what it sees in the sky. Also, the Sphinx at that exact date is looking east at the constellation of Leo, which is basically in the formation of a lion. So in 10,500 BC, we have a terrestrial alignment with the structures in Giza to constellations in the sky. Now, what's the purpose of that, other than to say, well, it's very possible then, based upon also geological evidence, that the pyramid and the Sphinx are way older than 4,500 BC. As it is, with the Egyptian culture having to carry these stones at their weight, 20 stones a day, 24 hours a day, there's just no way in the 20-year time period of the dynasty that the pyramid could have been completed. But it's interesting to also note that the Sphinx has very significant weathering on the sides and walls of the Sphinx enclosure, where it's been heavily inundated with rain. Now, there's no evidence for rain on the Giza Plateau for maybe 10,000 years. So it starts to line up a different picture for, we look at all these structures all over the earth that have megalithic precisions to astronomical alignments, where all the cultures previously coming in contact with this say, oh, well, our ancestors built this, and it's a power of their revered knowledge. But basically all they can do is point to the gods that taught them this information. So one of the things that I'm going to start to lead and show you is that if you're an ancient person living in a clay hut and using stone tools, and all of a sudden you see a firmament in the sky, or Ezekiel wheel within wheels and some type of craft is ascending, and a being steps out and says, hello. They didn't understand. And they said, you're a god. How can this be? Now, these same reports happening today, we call them alien abduction. And there's just a much higher level of involvement on, society's acceptance of this idea. But as you'll see, it's not such a far-fetched idea when we start to look at all these artifacts and evidence that point to the fact that ancient man was witnessing and had knowledge that they couldn't have just learned on their own. Here's an unfinished pyramid in Egypt, which is a very interesting undertaking. They saw that the sides of the pyramid started to slant in a direction where they couldn't support it, so they stopped building. So another interesting part of this, again, is the ancient astronomy. And a lot of these megalithic sites are aligned to astronomical precision points. So when we look at some of these cultures, the Egyptians and the Sumerians, and dive into this knowledge, the 12 houses of the zodiac, where does this information come from, and what does it actually mean? What was it being used for? What's the significance of this? One thing I would state is the Sumerians, as we'll talk about here, being the first civilized culture to show up, were the ones who actually were the first ones to denote 12 parts of the heavens and divide them into zodiacs. And the way this works was very simple. Just like you would hear, we're in the age of Aquarius or in the age of Pisces. The way that would work was simply that right at the time of helechlial rising, which is when you go out early in the morning and the sun is just about to pop up over the horizon, and it hasn't yet, and you can still see the stars against the backdrop of the sky. Well, what happens is when the sun starts to rise, if you can see, for instance, the constellation of Aquarius, whatever constellation the sun is rising in front of, you say, oh, we're in the age of Aquarius, we're in the age of Pisces. So it's a very interesting division of the heavens into 12 parts, but this knowledge is shown to have been held by high priests and courts from cultures, not just the Greeks and the Romans or the Egyptians, but it goes way all the way back into the Sumerians, as I'll show, having the first invention of this knowledge. But some of these cultures show knowledge of astronomy that it boggles, and it really is hard to put into perspective. The Egyptians, for instance, have not only a view of the 12 houses of the zodiac, or a divisional breakdown of the heavens, but they also took a much farther back view and had artifacts and replica elements that actually showed our position within the universe, where it wasn't just our solar system or our galaxy. It was a whole breakdown view, much larger out, which would show various other points in the universe. And these were inscribed on tablets and stones, where archaeologists have now broken down and visually found representations of the zodiac signs, but in a much more narrowed down view, where the view is in a much more expanded view of what they're explaining, and they've only identified the symbols that we know of in our zodiac, but it's a much more larger view that encompasses an astronomical layout that boggles modern archaeologists, and they really aren't able to accept a lot of the things that are presented, which we'll get into. So these artifacts still on display, and again, the archaeological community will accept the zodiacal symbols, but the large view of how they could have known the position in the universe or in our solar system really just kind of boggles modern science. So you can see various points of reference for these diagrams and the clarity of what they're showing. This is one zodiacal set, just like it would be changing in a calendar. So again, the division of the heavens into 12 parts, a very interesting number, 12. Why 12? Where does this information come from? And as we'll see, the number 12 is a very pivotal number of information stemming from the Sumerian culture. Now, this is a Sumerian tablet that's roughly 4,500 years old, and you can see that it has symbols representing like the scorpion, and you can see the turtle there and various other symbols that are known to be astronomical symbols. The turtle isn't one, but various astronomical data coming out of the Sumerian culture, where this was the earliest known sources of this information. So another interesting part of the tale for ancient technology coming out of these cultures, again, we have these megalithic monuments, astronomical alignments, and stories coming out from just about every culture on earth of a time when man had interaction with their living gods. Just like in the Bible, we hear about there were once a time when there were giants upon the earth. So what we also have is all around the world we have depictions of flight, meaning artifacts, depictions, wall reliefs that show man depicting what he viewed as flight. Now, again, if you're living in a clay hut and using stone tools, anything flying in the sky was alive. It was a bird. They didn't even have hot air balloons. So when we have these depictions of flight, and more specifically people coming down with the power of flight, it starts to raise the question of, well, what were they trying to tell us? Were they looking at birdmen? No. Interestingly enough, though, archaeologists, when they first started doing excavations in Iraq in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the archaeologists see all these wall reliefs and descriptions of what the Sumerians called their gods, which was labeled Anunnaki. And the term Anunnaki just simply means those who from heaven come to earth. But the archaeologists didn't understand what the Anunnaki could have meant. They're pulling out tablets that show descriptions of the outer planets, the distance of the outer planets between, how far is the distance between these planets. We didn't discover Pluto until 1930. So in the early 1900s, archaeologists start finding all these relics of the Anunnaki. They labeled them birdmen and said, oh, well, this is the Sumerian legacy of their mythology, talking about how they inscribed their creation myth. And so here's the change of information that we take from scholars like myself and Zacharias Sitchin, Eric von Daniken, is that modern archaeology says every culture has a creation myth. It's a story told to young children about how we get here. Well, what if these stories are actually fact, based upon ancient man's references available at that time? Anything flying, alive in the skies wasn't something they could attribute with a technological reference. So they would give it as a spiritual reference to say, wings, power of flight. Just like the Egyptians and the sun god Ra, this is carried over, but the original view of this winged disc, which we'll talk about further as we go into this, but this description by the Sumerians of a winged disc was something that carried over into other cultures like the Egyptian culture and Akkadian cultures as this symbol for some type of divine intervention coming down and using this form of symbology. This is a Sumerian god known as Ishtar, or also Inanna, that came down, and there's actually a Sumerian tale of how Inanna liked to fly the skies of earth, and one day she chose a Sumerian king, Gilgamesh, that she found attractive and wanted to take him up into her abode in the sky, and he said, "Thank you, but no thanks, because all the men that go up with you never come back and are turned up dead, so thanks, but no thanks." And this is an actual Sumerian tale that's talking about Ishtar. Very interesting things that come out of the Sumerian culture that we still use today. They have over 100 of the firsts attributed to what we use in the civilized culture: courts, laws, systems of judges, school education, medical science, astronomy, agriculture, writing, mathematics, and information about their living gods as to how they attributed all the information they gained. They said they learned from the Anunnaki. So looking at some of these other references for the power of flight, looking at the Egyptians and the Sumerians, we also have cultures around on other continents. Here's another thing found in a tomb. This was found in the tomb in Saqqara, Egypt, found to be dated around 200 BC, and the Cairo Museum basically labeled this a wooden bird model until someone that was doing excavations and was interested in artifacts that showed power of ancient technology or power of flight from various cultures said, hey, look, there's other artifacts that maybe show this could be a representation of an airplane. Because also we have in South America pre-Columbian civilizations that have these small models that are on display as insects, flying insects. Well, when we put it into a larger perspective, we can start to see that there might be a similarity being shown here of artifacts being displayed by ancient man, where maybe ancient man wasn't actually piloting these craft, but it's something they were seeing and were trying to replicate. Now, here's another fact that I would point out, is that we have something today's cultures call a cargo cult. So right after World War I, when American soldiers flew into remote areas like southern Africa and came across Aboriginal tribes, they land in their prop plane and get out and light up a cigarette and have a voice recorder and step up to the Aboriginal and they record his voice and play it back to him, and he's amazed. A voice recorder and lighters, and flying machines. They thought they were gods. And so when the soldiers packed up their camp and left to come back here, the Aborigines made straw models of these planes and scraped away runways and started worshiping the plane in hopes that the gods would come back. So that same story is shown here by ancient cultures, where they must have been witnessing something by trying to replicate and explain, but with only the knowledge they had available at that time. No technological references, only spiritual or things in nature, by giving it wings to say it had the power of flight. So very interesting artifacts. Here's another one found by Zacharias Sitchin, held in a Turkish museum, and it was not on display. The curator was convinced by Zacharias Sitchin to put it on display and label it, the headless. Actually, I'm not sure. I think it's just an unknown description, but Sitchin in his book labels this the headless spaceman, and you can see it has very rocket-like characteristics, very similar to the space shuttle. But in here, where we see the thrusters in the back, it looks like there could be a gentleman seated, only he's missing a head. So they call it, the headless spaceman. But very interesting artifact that just appears where's the reference point? Well, we're starting to see a perspective here. Another interesting artifact that just found some interesting relevance of rising up to something in the sky. No real significance other than I just thought it was an interesting artifact. So another area of getting in more into the ancient, or more into modern times, of ancient descriptions of technology being witnessed, yet what's the context, is through Renaissance artwork. Various places in Yugoslavia and in Renaissance artwork in Italy and places that we'll look at, there's descriptions and things being shown where if you look a little closer, you start to see stuff that, what does this mean? Here is a monastery in Yugoslavia that you can see here is a very, very fine fresco that was done somewhere in the realm of 1539, and it's a depiction of Jesus on the cross. But here we have in the backdrop of this strange aerial phenomenon being piloted by humans. And if you look closely at what's going on here, you can see that there are several craft, and there's obviously someone in there piloting it. You can see that the actual other people in this painting are looking up at this in awe and are actually shielding their face, going, "Oh, we see it," and you'll see this here in a minute. But it's a very interesting fresco that shows information that, again, what would they be depicting beings flying in the skies for? And obviously, everyone's scared or is paying attention to what's happening. So this starts to raise the question of, what was ancient man witnessing in the skies? And when we start to look at some of these wall reliefs, it really starts to raise the question of, are these actually, is it God that they're witnessing, or is this possibly just their understanding, of their lack of understanding for interpretation of what they were witnessing? Here's another interesting painting of the Madonna, and by, I believe it's St. Giovanni, and you can see here, very interesting religious painting, but as a backdrop to the painting, watch this. Look over her left shoulder. You see a gentleman with a dog shielding his eye and looking up in the sky at something. What could that be? Well, it looks very much to be some type of glowing or gaseous emitting craft that has enough attention so that the dog and the gentleman are looking up. And the artist made such a point to put that type of detail into the picture. And a lot of these artifacts are shown throughout religious artwork and in Renaissance artwork that really hasn't been scrutinized or looked at from this angle of what was the artist trying to tell us. Very interesting. And so this is nothing new. There are stories all throughout Renaissance artwork that to say that there were glowing shields in the sky that attacked us. And so these depictions put into a different context start to raise the question of, the same things that we report today as UFOs or unknown lights in the sky. We have a little bit more of a broader understanding of our views in technology to give a review of what we see. So when we go all the way back to the Sumerian culture, which is kind of the pinnacle point of what I focused on in my research, we start to see that even though the Sumerian culture is on record as being the first culture or civilization we have record of, there's texts that go way 10,000 years back in ancient India, and stories of Vimana and crafts that circled our earth and let down smaller crafts, and stories of the gods, how they fought in our atmosphere around the earth. But the only great civilization that we have as a complete civilized culture rests on the shoulders of the Sumerian culture, meaning they've left us artifacts, sites, the city of Ur, texts, a complete package to put into perspective what was going on in their time frame. So it's a very interesting tale because, as one of the famous authors, Zacharias Sitchin, has taught us, modern archaeologists will squabble over one phrase, over one word, Elohim, Anunnaki, and they didn't put it into a larger perspective of what the overall tale is being told here of our history. So there's a lot of discrepancies for when we start to think about extraterrestrial intervention or theories not accepted by archaeology and mainstream science, because where is it? Show me the alien. Show me the UFO. Well, you just have to look a little closer and be open-minded to the fact that ancient man didn't understand technology. But put through the eyes of what we now understand as technology, were these actually gods that they were interacting with, or possibly just more advanced technologically and spiritual beings that came here and influenced us? I will say one other thing too is, the Anunnaki spoke about this, that they believe in a force greater than theirs, a life force. But a lot of people religiously, me being raised as a Christian, hard to grapple with the idea that there could be aliens or extraterrestrials possibly that had a hand in our creation. But that doesn't mean that they're the gods. It just means that they're the gods with the small g. Someone still had to create them. Where did the Anunnaki come from? So it just goes higher and higher up the chain of more unanswered questions. But we can clearly see that some of these stories told by the ancient cultures really do have a reverence of importance when put into the realm of these are events that actually took place. If Jesus, as a renowned spiritual being, was here, where did he come from? It's not enough for me to say he just came from heaven. I don't know where heaven is. So we find information put into a different perspective that gives us more details. The Sumerians have many tales that parallel biblical texts, and we'll discuss some of these. But for instance, the creation stories, how we got here. For instance, in the Bible there are 7 days of creation. It's a condensed story of how we got here. The Sumerians have 7 tablets called the Atrahasis tale of creation, a much more lengthy description, exactly paralleling the modern day description in Genesis, but it's on a stone tablet, 4,000 years before any written language. So a lot of these artifacts that we show and see in Sumerian form start to lead us down a path of, okay, well, wait a minute, what does this really mean? The Sumerians had a very ingenious way of writing, too. They basically took an oversized screwdriver called a stylus and would twist it and turn it in wet clay, and then they would take this clay tablet, stick it in something called a kelm, a stove, and would fire it up, making it into stone, literally keying that phrase, writing in stone. What's interesting, though, is with our 26-letter alphabet, we think we're so proficient, and the Sumerian cuneiform alphabet consisted of over 400 characters. Right out of the Stone Age, the first written language, you can look this up, people, the first written language is cuneiform script, 400 character alphabet. Nice. So we start to look at some of the things that they wrote. They would sometimes also write on semi-precious stones. They had another form of written language. Let me just back up a couple slides to show you this thing here on the left. This is a cylinder seal. They had another form of written language where they would also reverse carve hieroglyphics or pictograms on what they call the cylinder seal, so they can then roll that over wet clay and leave a positive imprint, and they could easily disseminate information like an ancient printing press. So they had cylinder seals and tablets of information, and there are still thousands of tablets stored in the British Museum and in the Louvre that are not on public display, or haven't even been referenced by linguists that can study cuneiform script. There's only about 200 people in the world, Zacharias Sitchin being one of them, that can directly translate cuneiform script. So there are thousands of tablets still left in archives of information that, as we'll see, could hold miracle information, medical knowledge. Maybe there's some plant that we don't know about you eat and it cures cancer. I don't know. But as we'll see, the information they bequeath in other areas about their interaction with their gods, the astronomical data that they had, we can the astronomical data at least, we can verify what they were saying. So some of the tablets recorded astronomical events over hundreds of years. They would be able to tell you cycles of what they were seeing in the heavens over hundreds of years. For instance, this is one of the tablets that There were basically high priests and what were called scribes. So a scribe was someone who could read and write cuneiform, very privileged honor. Not everyone could read and write